casualties or civilians we would have if we didn't go in?
Well, not that we would have killed, but that, I mean, it's not clear how many, people were saying there was about to be a genocide or crimes against humanity in Libya. That seems quite shaky itself. It seems that the war that was precipitated by us going in, NATO going in, yielded a lot of fatalities, more so than would have happened if there had been no war. I mean, I'm not sure what.
This is kind of leading for, I kind of think you over-exaggerate or oversimplify our ability to kill or target civilians, and you use legal rules as a way for us to justify that or enable us to do so. But I think you fail to ignore some like the political factors domestically, will affect us domestically, internationally, when we see on the television, on the radio, we're killing civilians in Afghanistan, that hurts our cause. So I feel like there is morality still inherent despite the fact of these rules. And you see in the military, our rules of engagement are a lot more strict than they are if you follow low-act or Geneva conventions. And furthermore, you use a lot of these death numbers for civilians in World War I, World War II, continuing forward. But I don't know if you acknowledge the occurrence of insurgencies and our inability to distinguish between civilians and combatants as easily as we could have in their prior wars. So do you have any comments on how that influences the civilian casualties that you mentioned with all the insurgencies that have been?
So there were a couple questions. Let me start with the last one. The question was, I cited some numbers about how there were 10% of civilian casualties in World War I, 50% in World War II, and 90% in current conflicts. And the cadet asks, rightly, isn't this because there's more insurgencies and more non-traditional military forces involved? And the answer is yes. That was actually my point, which is that modern warfare is not like traditional warfare, and therefore the line between civilian and military blurs. That was the point I was trying to make, which is one of the reasons why the laws of war, which say, you must not kill civilians, becomes not a very helpful approach to thinking about laws of war. The earlier question, if I understood it correctly, is something along the lines of, we have all these laws and rules, and they're important because, if I get it right, you tell me if I don't, they're important to keep popular opinion on the side of the wars, because we say that we're fighting legally and we're fighting justly, and that's an important part of the political calculus in allowing our country to fight war today. Is that?
I feel like I think you're citing other people in that these new legal rules are enabling us to kill more civilians because there's military targets, etc., and the morality is kind of shifting away from war because of legal rules. But my question was about the not even domestic, but international pressure that makes us so we're restricting our own rules of engagement to not kill civilians, and killing them is detrimental to our own cause. So I feel like there is morality, despite the fact that arguing that these rules are kind of pushing morality.
Okay, good. There's a huge amount of international pressure today against killing civilians, right? Whether we're in Afghanistan or Iraq, or whether Israel's in the occupied territories or elsewhere. It's bad press to kill civilians, right? I mean, that's the question. And isn't that good, right? Is that your point?
I'm just saying there's some inherent morality still in the
Yeah, and so it's still inherently, every single one of us, I think the cadet's saying, and I think he's right, somehow feels that it's wrong to kill civilians. And we should use that basic moral intuition and tell soldiers wherever they are and whoever they're fighting for that they shouldn't kill civilians, and that will restrain soldiers. I think it's a good point. I think that's Waltzer's point, that we want to create this moral reality of war. What I've tried to say is, I think, a couple of things. Let me try and articulate them again. One is, the reality of war today is that that distinction is hard to maintain, right? For the exact reason, the first question you asked, that the distinction between civilian and soldier is becoming harder to maintain. All wars today target civilians. They have to. And so it becomes a question of, can you justify and say those civilians were actually justified as targets because they were either, in a town where there was harboring fighters, or they were in a munitions factory, or they were, et cetera, et cetera. Or in Japan, they were part of the will of the people, and we had to break the will of the people to save future lives. And so it becomes a question of justifying it through laws. And what I'm saying is, in a sense, that legal, as much as you say there's international pressure, and there is, interestingly enough, the international pressure is headline pressure, but it doesn't usually have much effect, and no one ever gets prosecuted. Very few people ever get prosecuted, because it's very hard, except for crimes against humanities, it's very hard to ever show that they weren't following the rules. At least if they got a good army, a professional army with clear legal guidelines. And the double intent standard and other standards make it very difficult to enforce. And so what I'm suggesting is that we might tell ourselves and be happy that we're fighting legalized and therefore authorized and therefore more just wars. But the facts are, more and more civilians are being killed in wars. And wars are more and more brutal for the people who are engaged in fighting them. And we should at some point acknowledge that.
Sir, you got the numbers from the Iraq body count, the 100,000. Does that include the civil war that was going on within Iraq, those deaths, or was that primarily like U.S. or?
I didn't cite numbers from Iraq, I don't think. You're asking where I got the 90% number?
Well, and you're talking about 100,000 today has been killed in Iraq.
Oh, okay.
Civil wars and, or if it's solely military.
The answer to that is I don't remember. I'd have to look up where I got those numbers from. I don't know off the top of my head. Can you say more about why it matters? Tell me.
So I just feel like your point is more civilians are being killed or targeted.
Right.
And ignoring some of the other factors that are involved. But now I understand that you were talking about insurgents, but I don't know if those numbers were bolstered because of all the other stuff going on in Iraq, with just ethnic fighting and everything else, or if that's just military numbers.
I took some of those numbers from an article by a man named David Luban. It's in my footnotes. I'd have to go back and look at his article and give you a more detailed response. I think the general trend is, do you contest the general idea that more and more civilians are being killed in war, or not?
I don't, but I understand. I didn't catch it in your essay about the rise of insurgents and our inability to discriminate between civilians.
Okay.
But you also look at World War II, and there's a lot of civilians there.
I mean, can I ask you a question, right? If you accept the general claim, right, and we can argue about numbers all we want, that more and more civilians are being killed, even as we more and more regulate and legalize warfare, do you think that in an important way, the legalization of warfare is in a way preventing us from addressing the fundamental fact that war is less and less just?
So I think legal rules are clouding the morality of wars that are different.
Yeah, I mean, helping us avoid the fundamental reality that Arendt says, which is that the idea of a just war today is anachronistic.
I agree to a certain extent, but I still think there is inherent morality. And my only example I have really is just the pressure we feel from killing civilians and us talking right now about,
Right.
But to the extent I agree with your main premise.
Okay. Yeah.
World War II was mentioned as, I think it is sort of a valid turning point for this war becoming less just, because at that point you have war sense that sort of potential for retribution has been removed. We no longer fight wars where a contingency is our total defeat, and it's always the victor who imposes whether or not the war is fought justly on the loser. So now we're fighting wars where even if we lose the war, so to speak, they are still not in a position to enforce upon us the immorality of our actions. So the loss of that could lead to wars becoming more unjust because there's no potential for retribution.
So it used to be that when we fight wars
There was a contingency for losing.
and we lost,
If we had.
we would be taken over? Or
Well, like Greeks and Romans fighting, if the Greeks commit war crimes to try to win and lose, then the Romans kill them all because they committed war crimes, and same on the other side.
Right.
But America fighting Iraq, even if we committed utterly ridiculous war crimes and then lost the war somehow, Iraq would have no ability to come back and kill all of us.
why not? Why, the question is, why would Iraq...
Because the powers related in the war are far more asymmetric than they've
Oh,
ever
okay.
been.
So it's a question of asymmetry. I mean, you know, is the asymmetrical nature of certain wars make it easier to commit war crimes? Possibly. I mean, it's an empirical question. I'd like to...
Not necessarily easier, but just less consequences.
Less consequence.
And therefore, it happens more just as a product of that.
It's an empirical question I'd like to... I haven't looked at. My initial reaction would be the opposite, which is the more powerful you are fighting a less powerful enemy, the less need you have to commit war crimes, and the more you can, in a sense, say, oh, we're fighting a just war. It's when you have an evenly matched set of combatants that you start to need to do things that might be more ethically and legally suspect because you really are worried about losing. But I don't know the answer to that. Yeah?
I wouldn't say it's just a question of doing them in order to win. I would say they just happen as a product of the environment of war.
Mm-hmm.
That they don't necessarily have any goal or end.
Yeah, I mean, that could be true. I mean, the United States is one of the only countries that still hasn't signed the International Criminal Court Treaty, the Statute of Rome, because we don't want our soldiers to be put on trial, and we have that ability to not sign it.
Yeah. In the end,
Which, one could say, how could we not sign it? And one could also say, at least we're admitting that we're not going to, that the we're basically the only honest country that admits that the ICC and this idea that there are laws of war in which individuals will be held responsible is completely anachronistic. I mean, maybe it was an act of honesty not to sign the ICC, the Rome Statute. I'm not sure that's how it was understood, but you can certainly make that argument. Yeah, back there.
Oh, I just wanted to make a comment. I looked up your citation for those numbers, and it's from rockbodycount.com, which is, they get the numbers from the DoD, and it is civilian deaths caused by, our military. It doesn't count, local, whatever stuff. It's our, things that are caused by the United States presence in Iraq.
Okay. So,
Would that include suicide bombings? So I would imagine that's where a lot of civilian casualties come from, internal conflict between Sunni and Shia.
do you know what?
It's our ordinance. It's our people that have died. And it's a really, really rough estimate because we don't actually know.
Yeah. I mean, the answer is I don't know offhand, but my understanding is that it's from the fighting between U.S. and Iraqi forces. Whether that includes Iraqi forces killing their own people, I actually don't know the answer to that. But you're saying it doesn't?
Yeah, it does.
But I don't know offhand, so I would have to say we'd have to look it up. And if you want to look it up, some people have their wireless devices. Yeah.
Just to go back to a few questions, we were talking
about the right to protect people within other country borders. And this might be veering a little bit too far off the topic for what you were studying for your paper, but I was wondering, are we allowed to use them as a means to an end where if there is a potential genocide or genocide that's going on, are we allowed to go in with, say, the Marines and the Army and actual boots on the ground, and once we've subdued any threat, then replace the government that was there? I mean, where does our authority stop? At what point are we obligated to leave the country, or at what point are we obligated to pretty much create a democracy or create a government that we see fit in the country and the region?
Well, these are excellent questions. I mean, the right to protect is a fairly new doctrine, and it comes out of exactly what the other questioner was asking about. You know, post-World War II, people said never again, and then we had, you know, Cambodia and then Rwanda and Sudan and other situations, and people said this is ridiculous. At some point, we have to understand that as an international community, we have a right to protect defenseless people who are being destroyed by their own government. It's a very complicated situation for a lot of reasons, because the fundamental principle of international relations today is state sovereignty. And how can you go and interfere with a state? And of course, we only would ever dream of interfering with a state that's weak, like Rwanda or Libya, not like Syria or China. You know, you're not going to go and protect the Tibetans. And so, you know, and then there's the question of, well, are we really just humanitarians going in and protecting these people from being killed, but we're going to leave the governments in? Well, okay, but what does that mean? That means that you have to go and sort of protect them, put a circle around them, but leave the government around, you know, there. So do you say, all right, the government in Syria can stay, but we're going to have international police in every corner to make sure that Syrian soldiers don't kill anyone, but we're not going to touch the government? I mean, doesn't seem very practical or realistic. And yet, once you go and say we're going to take over the government and make it a democracy, it doesn't look very much like right to protect. It looks like nation building and politics. You know, the point is that there's whole sorts of auxiliary issues behind any of these humanitarian missions. I mean, one example is the blockade of Gaza, right? This one that I've done a little work on, so I feel comfortable talking about it. You know, Israel blockaded Gaza for military and other reasons. And the world community's response was to say, all right, that's fine. A military blockade of Gaza is all right, but we should have humanitarian aid get through. So Israel said, great. Now, why does Israel say great? Because it justifies the military blockade. And so Israel and the United Nations work together and create a situation in which we let in humanitarian aid. And what do? You normalize the situation of people living under a blockade with humanitarian assistance. Interestingly enough, a number of Palestinians argued against the humanitarian aid. Why did they argue against the humanitarian aid? Because the humanitarian aid was making it easier to live under a state of blockade. And so they said, we need to be allowed to suffer and die and starve so that we'll actually resist. In a lot of ways, that's what people in Syria are saying now. We don't want humanitarian assistance because it infantilizes us. And so the right to protect is a very paternalistic idea that often treats people without the respect to have their own revolution or have their own resistance. On the other hand, do we just go and let people die again? Right? These are difficult issues. They're not going to be solved, you know, in armchair philosophy in an afternoon. But anyone who thinks that on either side there's simple questions or simple responses is I think fooling themselves. Yeah.
Sir, so you were mentioning that in sort of trying to shift away from discussing necessarily the justification of war into evaluating the justice of war, doesn't that allow for the evaluation of something being unjust by not going to war? And so in that case, isn't it almost changing right to protect and shifting all into responsibility to protect? Because after all, if there's just and unjust wars, there's also just
Right.
and unjust cases for you to not go to war as well, correct, sir?
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point. I mean, I don't think there's any, clear criteria about when you should go to war or when you should have a right to protect or a responsibility to protect. I think those are, in every instance, you have to make that judgment with the facts on the ground as you have them, without appealing to, this law or that principle. You basically have to look and say, look, if I go into Libya, we're going to kill a lot of people. We're going to lose some of our own people. We're going to spend a lot of our money that could be spent here. If I don't go into Libya, some people, there might be a repression, a cause of freedom might suffer, a dictator we don't like will be strengthened, we'll look bad in the world, we'll look weak. There are a lot of issues at play. And you need a leader who's willing to make those judgments and articulate meaningful grounds for them in every particular case. That's what a leader is. And to say we have a responsibility to protect strikes me as, in a sense, passing the buck of leadership. That's what I'm suggesting.
I just want to make a little point about the fact that we support dictatorships. I think it's kind of silly to be like, oh, do we have the responsibility to go in and end these dictatorships when, we supported Gaddafi for years and years and years and years, and we knew what he was doing. We supported Saddam Hussein in the 90s. We do this. Until it is no longer economically viable for us to support military dictatorships, we do.
Yeah,
like in Iran, ages ago, but still, we put them in power. We put down their revolution because it was not economically sound for us.
Let's stipulate that we support dictators, we support democracies, we support lots of different kinds of countries. So what?
I think that it is.
It's hypocritical? No, it's based on our interests. If we were to oppose every single dictatorship in the world, we wouldn't have a lot of friends.
I'm not even opposed, just not support would be nice.
Are you saying there's not a valuable reason to go to war, saying that it's because we're taking down a dictator after we support the dictator?
Well, yeah, because we have, one of the reasons that it took so long to get involved, to get Gaddafi out, was because we were like, well, we sort of, not put him there, but kept him there. Quite a few times, we've given him tons of money.
One of the main justifications we gave for the war in Iraq was to create a democracy. Is that a valid reason to go to war? It's an interesting question. There are many people who argue that democracy is a human right, and that to a certain extent we have a responsibility to protect those who are being forced to live not under a democracy. Now, you can have that debate. You can also say, well, we support some dictators and not others. Well, clearly we're not going to go and fight a war against every dictator. But you do have to ask whether the fact that we are supporting democracies in a war against Iraq is a meaningful justification for war. You had a question earlier a while, yeah.
It's about the difference between the just war, like the theories of just war, and the various legal statutes of what war should be like if it were to be, if it were to be just. And I'm actually a little confused as to what the difference would be in that, because I feel like a lot of times we're talking about what is just in a war, and we're still talking about all these laws that, if you're talking about if you're counting how many civilians died in a war, and whether that's fair or unfair, and whether it was what were the right ways of doing it, then now we're talking about the legal procedures of conducting the war as opposed to. Do you follow my question?
I'm trying. Can you say it one more time?
Okay, so I'm finding it a little difficult to like distinguish between a theory of just war
Mm-hmm.
and the legal statutes that define, that's a second, the just in bello. And so the rules that regulate what that would be.
So are you saying you're having a hard time distinguishing use ad bellum versus use in bello, or you're having a hard?
In bello was like I see how both of them are an important part of theory of just war.
Yeah.
But you mentioned how in discussing in bello, we talked about how just war theory is not about that in general. But I feel like a lot of what just war is, like the theory of just war, is actually what just in bello.
Yeah, no, I think, if I understand the question related to use in bello, and as far as I understand it, and most people today, the crux of just war thinking, just war theory, focuses on use in bello and how we fight a war, not on whether the war is just. Because, as I said a number of times, and it's an interesting point, no one has good criteria to determine when a war is just or not. So we have a tendency to focus on something we think we can have clear criteria on, namely what you're allowed to do in a war. Now, from that, can you clarify your question?
But your paper as it's presented distinguishes the theory of just war from all the different pieces of paper that define what is right and wrong in war.
So, I mean, I don't know if about a theory of just war because I'm not sure what the theory is. What I find most appealing about someone like Walzer is actually not a theory of just war, but what he calls this moral reality of war. The need to talk about it, and the need to address it honestly, and engage in talking about how we're fighting a war realistically, without sugarcoating it, and have the citizenry and the soldiers and the politicians together all come to a kind of common understanding of the moral reality of war. Only then can we have a meaningful conversation about when we should go to war and how we should fight a war. That's the opposite of a theory of just war. I mean, that's how I understand it. So I think we need to have a meaningful conversation about the justice of war and avoid theories of justification of war. That's the claim that I'm making. Is there anyone who hasn't asked a question? All right, go ahead.
So I'm kind of caught up on our last conversation.
Yep.
You caught me off guard with asking me a question.
Yeah.
So I was thinking, as a future United States Army officer, I follow all laws or orders, unless they are immoral, unethical, or illegal.
Right.
And if I follow a command that is immoral, I'm culpably liable legally. So is there a tension between what you're saying about the difference between morality and legal rules? Do you have
So you're as a future military officer, you're responsible to follow all commands,
unless they're immoral,
Unless-
unethical, or illegal?
unless they're immoral, unethical, or illegal.
And people have been prosecuted in the past for.
And if you do so, if you do follow a command that's immoral, unethical, or illegal, you're subject to prosecution. And then your question is,
Isn't that create some tension between your claim that all these new laws of war were kind of going away from
right?
morality?
And doesn't that, in a sense, refute the entire premise of my paper?
But this is just the United States. I don't know how the other countries.
The United States is currently fighting. Well, we just ended a war in Iraq. We're fighting one in Afghanistan. You probably know better than I where else we're fighting wars. How many people are prosecuted for doing things that are immoral, illegal, or unethical?
I don't know, the Marines when they,
Do you think most people who do things that are either immoral, illegal, or unethical are prosecuted?
I really don't have anything. Foundation knowledge.
All right. I mean, just one. I'm not an expert in military law, so I'm going to say that. I did write a paper a couple of years ago on judgment, and I use as an example the prosecutions against people in the United States who tortured. Right, just one example. There were a number of U.S. military personnel who engaged in torture, both in Abu Ghraib, in Afghanistan, and in Cuba, at Guantanamo. Very few ever, a number were charged, very few were prosecuted, and they weren't even discharged. Right? They were just, one was found guilty and given no discharge. We have evidence of a number of militaries who killed this guy, the Iceman in Afghanistan, clearly admitted, proven, killed a prisoner under torture. No disciplinary action. Now, I don't want to get involved in, they should, they shouldn't, whatever. We just heard this story about a certain number of people in Afghanistan who urinated on enemy soldiers, right? No, as far as I know, there hasn't been any meaningful disciplinary action. The point is to say, and I'm not saying that we're wrong or right to discipline them or not discipline them. I'm saying is, the reality, as I understand war today, is that these things happen. And maybe we should try and prevent them from happening. I think we should. But I think it's folly to think that we're fighting a war without any illegal, unethical, or what's the third, immoral acts, and that everyone who does such an act will be prosecuted. I just don't think it's the case. And I don't think it could be the case. And while I strongly believe, I think I share your intuition that we should encourage our soldiers to do so, and we should drive it into you, and us to fight that way. There's a certain hypocrisy in it, as far as I see it, and we should also have an honest conversation about that. Yeah, in the back. You can't. The lights are killing me here.
This is more a question towards the cadet that mentioned the ruled out, if the order is immoral, unethical, or illegal. Like, what is the retribution if you do not follow an order which is not immoral, unethical, or illegal? Does that make sense?
You fail to follow an otherwise lawful order?
Yes. This is more curiosity.
If you fail to follow a lawful order, you can be prosecuted under Article 92 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and you can be sent to jail.
Right, but if it's an immoral,
It's otherwise unlawful order. In other words, there's a consequence for not following orders.
but if it's a lawful, if it's an unlawful or immoral or unethical order, you're not.
If it's a manifestly unlawful order, somebody says, you killed prisoners of war.
Yeah.
And you say, I can't do that.
Right.
I have a duty not to do that. I have a duty to report that.
Yeah.
You say you have a duty.
I'm sorry to cut you off. Isn't that entirely subjective?
It's subjective.
Well, you're asking whether illegality and immorality is subjective.
I think it is subjective.
Well, these become, what does it mean to be subjective? I think the Army has a very clear sense of what's illegal. I mean, the Army is, I want to at least say this. There are very few institutions left in our country that actually insist that the members of those institutions think and be aware of the fact that they have a right and a responsibility to resist unethical and illegal orders. How many people on Wall Street are told that? And how many people in politics are told that? And how many students and academics are told that? Very few. And so the military is one of the few institutions left that actually insists upon the members of its services that they have that duty to resist illegal and unethical orders. And it's an important part of the military culture, which is why, which is why the military is often the institution arguing for clear laws to make it objective, to make it clear what it is and what is not that can be ordered and should be resisted. You're asking, is that subjective? Well, to the extent we try and list the illegal and legal orders in a field manual or in other codes, it's an attempt to make it objective. You're never going to list them all, and no one reads them all. Or if you read them all, I'm sure you've forgotten them the next day after the test. And so at some point it becomes down to a young person's, usually, young people fight war, ethical judgment, which we hope is not subjective. We hope is based on having studied and learned and thought and internalized norms of our civilization and our society. But at some point it requires them to make that judgment. Yeah.
A few questions ago, you mentioned how there's no criteria for a just war, and also how in modern day society there can be no just war, but do you see an opportunity for a just war at all in the future?
Well, I mean, someone brought up Rwanda, right? Would that be a just war? It depends on how it's fought. What's amazing about any war or any act is that whoever does it thinks they're justified when they're doing it, right? If I go and steal a TV because I want to watch the Super Bowl or the presidential debates, and I want to be an informed citizen and I don't have a TV, I justify it. I may know I'm breaking a law, but I say, look, I'll give it back later. Or it's more important for me to be informed than for him to have 6 TVs in his kitchen. And so the point is, no one does an act without thinking it's right that I do it. They may know it's illegal, but they think it's right. Well, it's the same with war. Every side is going to justify its war. There are wars I may think are just. Rwanda might be one of them. Some people may think Libya was a just war. Some people may think Iraq and Afghanistan were just wars. So I'm not saying that we'll never have a war that people don't argue is just. And I'm sure there are other people who think that all those wars are unjust. And so what I am saying is the international community of all different countries with different politics and different views has been unable to come up with criteria to say when is a war just or unjust. And I don't think that will change. If we go into Libya, there's always going to be somebody who says that was unjust. And if Iraq attacks Kuwait, there are going to be some countries and some people who think that was just. So I guess what I'm saying is not that I'm not saying there will never be a war that I think is just. I'm just saying I don't think the international community cannot at this point articulate norms of a just war. Yes.
I would imagine that we can all agree that any global notion of justice is completely unrealistic. or that there can be sort of a completely global agreement on what's right and what's not. Given that there is that diversity in this, freshly globalized world, why should we be even necessarily trying to come up with some sort of international convention of what is a just war and what isn't? When in Bhutan, they want a king, they don't want democracy.
I mean, Jesse's saying, if given the fact that we can't agree internationally on what is a just war, why should we try? Well, that's the question the paper asks, right? The question asks, should we justify war? And I'm suggesting that in a certain way, the discussion and the effort to justify war is anachronistic. That's actually the question the paper asks. The response, as I've tried to say, is we need to have a conversation about it to create what Walzer, and I'm trying to adopt this language, calls the moral reality of war. But what I'm suggesting is that that's not an attempt to come up with norms or rules, but to talk about war in a morally meaningful way. And that's the distinction I'm still trying to make. You're all pushing me to make it better. I appreciate that. And now I have to go rewrite the paper. Yeah. Yes.
Sir, do you think it's possible to even come up with the moral reality of war if you have not experienced it yourself? For instance, we talk about having an honest discussion, but what use is that honest discussion without any sort of tangible, relation to the subject matter?
Yeah. It's an excellent question. I assume most of you haven't experienced it, right? Not yet. Are we just fooling ourselves, right? And the way to talk about this from my point of view is such. There have been what's it called? Has anyone ever heard of the book The Education of Little Tree? You know this book? So a number of years ago, a book came out called The Education of Little Tree, about 20 years ago, I believe. And it was about a Native American, young boy growing up, and it was a bestseller, and it was considered to be one of the greatest expressions, autobiographical expressions of the Native American experience in modern times. And it was taught in colleges across the country and front page of the New York Times, a big deal. And then someone found out that the guy who wrote it was a member of the KKK under a pseudonym. I bring this up because there have been other examples too, where there have been a number of African American authors who've said, white folks can't understand jazz, right? And then they've been played jazz that they think is the best jazz in the world that's actually done by whites. And all I'm saying is that one of the reasons you guys at West Point and we at Bard study literature is that literature allows us to enter worlds through imagination that, if it's well done, actually can sometimes be more real than reality. One of the reasons it's important to read literature of war, for you guys and for us, is because sometimes the literature of war will actually bring war to us in a palpable way. A, because we can't fight it ourselves, or we're not fighting it ourselves, but even sometimes more vividly than for many people who are fighting a war. I'm not saying all literature, but I'm saying that part of the conversation has to be people reading accounts of war. Good ones. Right? Both memoirs of soldiers, but also the Iliad. And, one of my favorite books, a book I cite a lot in this paper, The Warriors by J. Glenn Gray, which is one of the great books, I think,